It's recording, so I'm going to start now.
Right.
Okay. It is my pleasure to introduce Clarence Moriwaki, who is the president of the Bainbridge Island Japanese American community and is a founder and past president of the Bainbridge Island Japanese American Exclusion Memorial Association. Over the past 20 years, Clarence has worked to create and develop the memorial and earn its designation as a National Historic Site. For his efforts, in 2008, he was awarded the National Parks Conservation Association's highest national accolade, the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas Award, and he was named the 2018 Citizen of the Year by the Bainbridge Island Chamber of Commerce. Clarence is the principal of Forest Edge Communications, and he has served as CEO of the Japanese Cultural and Community Center of Washington, a senior aide and spokesperson for President Bill Clinton, Governor Mike Lowry, Congressman Jay Inslee, Lieutenant Governor John Scherberg, the Washington State Senate, Kitsap County Sound Transit, and the Portland Rose Festival Association, and campaign manager for the ACLU of Washington. Clarence was also a news reporter, and program producer for 3 Seattle radio stations, a member of the Tukwila City Council, and candidate for the Washington State Senate. He has served on the board of directors for numerous statewide, regional, and local organizations, and he is the state's first and only 12-year-old Eagle Scout. So Clarence, thank you so much for being here. We're looking forward to your presentation, and I'll let you take it away.
Well, thanks so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all who are tuning in and joining us for this presentation. As you can see, I call this Let It Not Happen Again. It's Lessons of the Japanese American Exclusion. And I'm sure that all of you have either produced, watched, or have to present a PowerPoint presentation. So I am pre-warning you that this is a PowerPoint presentation, but I certainly hope that you don't find mine torturous. I call it the presentation of 4 H's: history, honor, healing, and hope. And here in our region, we have to start with our history, and it is the indigenous people. In this case, it would be the Suquamish Indians, who had been in central Puget Sound for about 10,000 years. And they had many famous sons. The most famous, of course, was Chief South. Chief South became the namesake for the city of Seattle. The first Europeans did not come to our region until 1792. This is an artist's depiction of the HMS Discovery by Captain George Vancouver, anchored just off of Bainbridge Island. And in 1841, the United States Navy came in. It was a man named Lieutenant Charles Wilkes. He circumnavigated our island and named it after his good friend Commodore William Bainbridge, who never set foot in Washington State. What they found in this region, from Canada all the way down to Northern California, were these massive old growth forests. You can see a small man in a corner. That would be probably a middle-aged tree, maybe only 400 or 500 years old. Some of these were 1,000 years old. And so every place that had a harbor and every place they could get to these forests, mills showed up. Here on Bainbridge Island, it was in Blakely Harbor. This is a picture of it in the late 19th century. And at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, this was the largest lumber mill in the entire world, bringing in people from all around the world: Swedes, Norwegians, Croatians, the Japanese, Chinese, Filipinos, working at the mill. And also you can see in the background what looks like burned out trees, but that's also another industry. That's the Hall Brothers Shipyard, at that time building the largest ships that were available in the world. Everybody worked together in these both the mill and the shipyard, and they were very dangerous places, so you really had to trust and work closely with your co-worker. So all of these people became very close, very tight-knit in their community. And the census came by in the late 1880s, but they found Japanese names like mine, Moriwaki or Yamamoto or something like that, very hard to spell and or pronounce. So for many years, about a decade or so, all of the Japanese that were on the island were known by a number. This is a map of what that area looked like at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, Blakely Harbor. You can see all of the industries around the Hall Brothers Shipyard is located above the word Blakely. To the left of this picture, near the mouth of the bay, is the mill area. I'm going to focus on the lower left corner of this place, the Blakely Harbor towns of Yama and Nagaya. Nagaya was the town where the first Japanese settlers came to work in the mill and the shipyard. And later, when their families came, they moved up into Yama, which means mountain or hill in Japanese. That's where the families were. And this is a picture of what Yama looked like. They built all their homes out of the spare lumber from the mill. And one of the things that distinguished the Japanese immigrants versus all of the other immigrants was that The Japanese were coming in the 1880s of a recession in Japan, and many of them had businesses. They were entrepreneurs, professionals, or other things. And so they essentially started the company town. Mr. Takayoshi was one of the lead people. He had a hotel, he had a mercantile store, there was a restaurant, a bathhouse, all these industries, and became the company town where all those other people from other countries came and shopped and patronized the Japanese businesses. Mr. Takayoshi was so successful, he had one of the first telephones in central Puget Sound. His most famous industry, of course, was the ice cream parlor. So everybody loved it, including the children. It brought these kids together. The mill had burned down twice in its iterations. In the 1920s, people had to find something else to do. So here on Bainbridge Island, they started taking the land, clearing out the giant stumps with World War I surplus dynamite, and creating strawberry farms. They were the most productive strawberry farms in the entire central Puget Sound region. Bainbridge Island were famous around the world. They also started to continue their other businesses. This is a picture of Bainbridge Gardens, a nursery, the grocery store you see here. It had a gas station. Again, all these businesses started on the island as well as the farms, and this tight-knit community became more tight-knit. It was a closed ecosystem. People didn't travel like they do now on the ferry, so you shopped on the island, you worked together. It kept everybody close. And also, one thing that kept the island close was our state was one of the first to have compulsory public education, which meant that every child must go to school. And I would contend that no child is born prejudiced, so all of these children, again, a very close, tight-knit friendships and bonds created on Bainbridge. And things are moving on very nicely, and then the Imperial forces of Japan came to the territory of Hawaii and bombed the 7th Fleet in Pearl Harbor. Here's a picture of that famous USS Arizona sinking into harbor. On that day, and the next day after, the FBI, hours after the bombing, went to Hawaii and 23 other cities in the mainland. And within 48 hours, they went to all these homes without any search warrants. They took whatever they wanted. And in that time, they actually rounded up 1,291 Japanese American aliens and first generation people. Again, without warrants, without any charges, just took them in. On February 4th, 1942, the FBI came to Bainbridge Island, and with the assistance of every Kitsap County sheriff and deputy, as well as the Washington State Patrol troopers, they raided all 50 Japanese American homes simultaneously with the objective of making sure to hit every home so not one home could tip off another that the FBI were coming to their homes. And with that, they took away 35 of our members, again, without any search warrants. This went out through almost every Japanese American home on the West Coast. The FBI raided these homes. On December 11th, 1942, the Western Defense Command was created. This is a few days after Pearl Harbor, and this is the first commander and only commander, Lieutenant General John DeWitt. And on March 2nd, 1942, General DeWitt issues Public Proclamation Number 1. It designated military areas on the western halves of California, Washington, Oregon, and parts of Arizona. And these areas had a curfew imposed only on the Japanese Americans, and everybody had to be in at home at 8 at evening and could not get out until 6 in the morning. A few months after that, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, and established a War Relocation Authority on March 18th, but this created the exclusion orders, and the order stated all persons of Japanese ancestry would be moved in 6 days. The first exclusion order came a few days after that, a month, and a few days after February 19th on March 24th. This is Civilian Exclusion Order Number 1. The order stated all persons of Japanese ancestry will be removed in 6 days. They were only allowed what they could take, what you could carry or wear, and they had to show up at the Anderson Hardware store and register. And here, everybody had to come and show up, including bringing your children so they could verify that those folks are there. That poster went up on March 24th. This picture is taken on March 25th. This is a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Evansto Hiroto, and this is his wife, Miki. And they showed up to register. And I would suspect that shortly after this picture was taken that they weren't smiling, because Mr. Hiroto was informed since he was a Filipino American, he could not join his wife or he would have to stay back. He had been reported to say, I will renounce my citizenship. I want to be with my wife. I want to leave with her, but they would not allow that to happen. So he had to stay behind when they were finally removed. Everybody on the island had to figure out what to do with their properties. It's worth noting here that in Bainbridge Island, Almost everybody who had a neighbor who would take care of their properties or farms did. And we had about 80% ownership of farms. Now, this was a difficult thing. A lot of people go, how do you do that? Because there was the alien land laws in the 1920s that forbid anybody of Asian ancestry to own property. But we did have a lot of owners of property. We had technically 5-year-old landlords. It was okay to have your children be a title holder because by birthright they're a US citizen. So that's how they were able to get their property held and own some land. Everybody had found neighbors look after their property, promised to take care of their taxes and the rest. And then on March 30th, the ferry finally arrived. This is a picture of the current Winslow ferry terminal. You can see the bayonets drawn. And they would later go to the south side of the harbor to Egodale to pick up the Japanese. If you were not able to have someone drive you in your car or have them drive you in a car, the government gave you this transportation and troop carrier, and everybody went. This is a picture of the few orphans that were on the island. And the oldest member of our community, Reverend Hirakawa, on the right, he was 77 years old at that time. This is a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Moji. They were a couple. She was in her 40s, he was in his 50s, and they were a childless couple. It's not clear whether that was by choice or perhaps she was unable to conceive, but they did always have their one child, and it was always a beautiful dog. In this case, it was King, a white Samoyed. And you can see this picture taken here. He wanted to get into the truck. He later did jump into the truck. The two soldiers who were in that photograph pulled King out, and for the first time in this 5-year-old dog's life, he barked and almost tried to bite these soldiers. The two soldiers had to restrain King as the truck was being taken away. The Mojis, like other families on the island I mentioned, their neighbors, of course, said, yes, we will look after your property, and they pledged to look after their beloved King. But King was so despondent and wilt that he refused to eat or drink, and in about a week he passed away. This is a very iconic photo of the forced removal. This is a picture of Fumiko Hayashida. She's 21 years old in this photograph. That's her 13-month-old daughter, Natalie. And she is pregnant with her third child, Leonard, who, when born in the Manzanar concentration camp, would be the first Japanese American baby born in a camp. She becomes a very iconic picture, not only for this movement, but for what we did on Bainbridge Island, of which I'll talk later. The soldiers in their time got to know the Bainbridge Islanders in those 6 days very closely, and they were very kind to all of the people when they had to be forcibly removed on March 30th. Again, the families and the children were very close together. A lot of the high school seniors had skipped school under threat of expulsion to say goodbye to their friends. And this picture shows how those soldiers loved and got along with the Japanese Americans. The editor of the newspaper, Walt Woodward, was interviewing the commanding officer of this regiment from New Jersey. And the commanding officer said, we don't know why we're here. We don't know why we're doing this. This is the hardest thing that we've ever had to do. So here's a picture of them gathering. You can see some of the cars that were either owned by the Japanese Americans or their friends drove them. You can see the soldiers marching down the road. And the far left of this picture, out of frame, would be the Egodale ferry dock. The ferry arrived at 11:03 that morning, and about 5 minutes after that, the Japanese started boarding the ferry. 227 people, all wearing layers of clothing. They were only allowed to take what they could carry or wear. So they had maybe 4 or 5 layers of clothing underneath the clothes you see there. And the ferry left. They're going across the Puget Sound. This is Sumiko Kurofurtia. She is saying goodbye to Bainbridge Island. They arrive in Seattle. Thousands of people are watching them board these trains. And they are saying goodbye to the island, and the trains had, saying goodbye to Seattle, and these trains had large blinds on the windows that were darkened, and they had to keep those darkened shades down the entire 3-day and 2-night trip. And they arrived in Lone Pine, California, high in the Sierra Nevada deserts. And from there, they boarded a bus. They rode another 2 hours and arrived here at the Manzanar concentration camp on April Fool's Day, April 1st, 1941. You can see it under construction, and if you note in this picture, I hope you can see that's dated February 2nd, 1942. So this was literally the day after the Japanese Americans from Bainbridge arrived. These barracks were very hastily built, and they were 120 by 25 feet wide, and they were broken up into 20 by 25-foot apartments. There were no insulation, as you can see. There was no sheetrock, tar paper on the outside. You had a bare cot, a wood stove, and a light bulb. For the first several hundred thousands, everybody got one large sack and one small sack. They were instructed to fill these sacks up with hay, and a large sack would serve as your mattress, and the smaller one would be your pillow. Again, you settled in as best you could. This is a model of what Manzanar looked like at its full build out. This is from the Japanese American National Museum, America's Concentration Camp exhibit there in Los Angeles. And by September of 1942, many of the Los Angeles area Japanese Americans had come in, and more than 10,000 of them had crowded into 504 barracks in this camp. They were organized into 36 blocks, and they were divided into four apartments. In the middle, they had one male and one female latrine, a major mess hall, and then a laundry facility. All of the camps were placed in desolate areas, and they all had very hot summers with blowing wind and sand, and in the winter was just the opposite. It was just freezing snow, and of course there was no pavement or gravel roads, so it'd be muddy. It was a very difficult place to get around. One of the big shocks for the Japanese Americans was this. All 10 camps have all their stories, but all 10 camps share one story of at least seeing one elder person walking out in the middle of the night, 2 or 3 in the morning, to go to the latrines. And they would watch them go out. It wasn't that they were noisy. It was that the soldiers would see someone move and they would follow them at a searchlight as if they were on a Hollywood stage. People would wake up and watch them walk to the latrine, and then that light would stay on and follow them back to their barracks. And they did this because it was their only chance to have privacy, to have some dignity. They did not want to be around and do this in front of total strangers and have showers in front of strangers as well. So it was very hard for the first generation Japanese Americans to deal with, and eating together in large groups. This is where a lot of families started to split up, because the young boys and girls, they started hanging out with friends in other blocks where the food was better, or the boys and girls might be cuter or whatnot. And so they didn't eat together as a family, which was a strong tradition in most Japanese American families. So that was starting the separation of a lot of family units. But a lot of the first generation did not mind that, because they wanted their children to have as normal a life as possible. So they made sure that they had every activity that they could give them that they would have outside of barbed wire. Education was huge. They wanted to make sure their children had school, so they converted barracks into classrooms, and every activity, music, dances, everything that they could do that they would have if they were, because they didn't know how long they'd be there. They thought might be here 5 years, 10 years. So let's make this as much of a community experience as possible. All of the camps did sports, and this is Manzanar, the girls playing basketball outside. But all 10 camps loved the all-American pastime of baseball. And every one of the 10 camps had to make their own baseball diamonds. The incarcerees built these baseball teams. This is the one at Manzanar. Again, a city of 10,000 people, so thousands of people watch these teams play. This is a picture by Toyo Miyatake called Three Boys Behind Barbed Wire. You can see the guard tower up in the distance. Now here is the exclusion area. Coming north in Washington State, that red line comes down from Canada, Highway 75 and the Columbia River. In Oregon, it went east of the Cascades to Bend, Oregon. You kind of see a line of Bend there. All of California and southwestern Arizona. If you were 1/16th Japanese American and you were on the area I just described to the west in the darker pink, you were going to be forcibly removed to one of these 10 major concentration camps, or you were already arrested in a Department of Justice camp from all of those FBI raids that happened shortly after Pearl Harbor. Another 6,000 babies would be born inside of one of these areas designated by the 10 triangles. So all told, 120,000 Japanese Americans were placed in concentration camps or other facilities for the duration of the war, which was about 95% of all Japanese Americans in the entire continental US. There were no civilian exclusion orders for German Americans or Italian Americans. That would have been rather impossible. There's about 4 million of those. So there's hardly 14 million rather. So this is only focused for the Japanese. You can see by this map here that the Bainbridge Islanders, as I mentioned, were the first ones to occupy the concentration camp in Manzanar. After about a year, most of them transferred to Minidoka, requested that because that's where all the Seattle people were. Plus they wanted to get away from the Los Angeles Japanese Americans. They weren't getting along very well. So Bainbridge Island went to Manzanar first. Minidoka was completed by the time they got there and placed in Block 44, which was one of the last blocks in that camp. So therefore, they were kind of the bookends, the first community into a camp under construction, placing one of the last barracks and one of the last blocks of a concentration camp to be finished. So that was tough, but a lot of Bainbridge Islanders say, well, that was bad, but at least we didn't have to go to a assembly center. And the assembly centers were these places that, because they could not build those concentration camps fast enough, they were temporary holding places of which the hundreds of tens of thousands of Japanese would be held until the camps were completed. Here in Washington State, the assembly centers, the places in orange, you can see Seattle metro area, and then to its south, the Pierce County area, they went to the Puyallup Fairgrounds. And in Eastern Washington, the blue area, they went to the Portland, Oregon Fairgrounds. And these fairgrounds were not, they didn't have barracks finished there either. So many of the first hundreds and thousands that went to the barracks stayed in the stalls of where the livestock had previously lived. The horses, the cows, the pigs, and the rest. That's where they stayed in their incarceration until the concentration camps were completed. The dark blue areas in Western Washington, that's Kitsap County and most of King County, went to the Pinedale Assembly Center outside of Fresno, California. In green, the rest of Western Washington, the peninsula plus, they went to Tule Lake in Northern California, which later became a full-blown concentration camp and then incarceration center. This is a map of the distribution areas for all of where they went for the concentration camps. One thing I like to note, if you know the pullouts of the Los Angeles and the Bay Area and the rest of the urban areas, you can see how the government deliberately split up the communities in those mosaic of colors. They wanted to split up the Japanese American communities deliberately to make sure that they could not be communicating, that they cut off the head of the snake, if you will. Here in the Washington area, the Seattle and Pierce County areas, they went to Minidoka, which is in southern Idaho. The rest of Western Washington was already in the Tule Lake concentration camp, and the Eastern Washington group in blue ended up at the Heart Mountain concentration camp in Wyoming. At its full build out, this is how many people lived in those camps. This does not include the thousands of War Department of the War Relocation Authority personnel and the military security personnel that were also occupying these camps. In some cases, they were the first or second or third largest city in those states. They tried to make life as normal as possible, and almost the families did. This is Kei Sakai Nakao. She has actually turned 100 years old last year, and that's her son, Bruce. And people lived their lives, but when the war went on and on, our government was losing lives. We lost about 500,000 lives in World War II. So they came to the camps and asked people, asked young men in particular, we need you, we would like you to enlist. And the call did. There were 276 Japanese Americans on Bainbridge Island. 68 answered that call, 66 men and 2 women enlisted or were drafted into the US military. Here's a picture of Art Kura. He married Flo just before he was to ship off, and he joined what was called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. This is an all-segregated unit of Japanese Americans fighting in the European theater. They were known for their bravery. They were known as the Purple Heart Battalion. They have more medals and more casualties per unit and duration of service of any other unit in American military history. One of the turning points in their case was the saving of the Lost Battalion. It was the Texas battalion that was trapped by the Germans in France, in Italy, France. They saved 211 of those soldiers. They were told to go up there because 2 attempts to save those Texans had failed. The 442nd had 1 day rest after 5 days of battle, went up. It took them 5 days to rescue those soldiers, and they did. They saved 211 out of the 275 Texans, but 161 of the 442nd were killed. Another 1,200 suffered casualties, and 42 of them were captured by the Nazis. The 442nd won many presidential unit citations. They won 7 in all. Only about 5% of units ever win one. Here's a picture of Harry Truman giving them one of those presidential unit citations, and at that day he said, you not only fought the enemy, you fought prejudice, and you won. This is a turning point in America where a lot of people heard about this and began to have a different look at many of the Japanese Americans, these Japanese saving these vaunted Texans. So it was a very good public relations effort, if you will, for the community. But before they could even enlist and or even get drafted, you had to fill out this loyalty questionnaire. And these 2 questions, 27 and 28, are the ones that everyone focuses on. The first one, as you can read there, many who said, I'm not going to fight for the country. I'll fight if you allow me my freedom and my parents' freedom to get out of these camps. I'll serve then. The second question about allegiance, many were offended. Many said, how can I don't have any allegiance to Japan or the emperor. I have no idea who that person is. And the forswear is kind of a trick question. It assumes and implies you had previous allegiance to the emperor of Japan or the nation of Japan. So it's kind of a trick question. Many of these men said, that's insulting. I am an American citizen. If you answered no to any of these questions, you're going to be placed in a special place in Tule Lake that was considered the resistors. And people who answered no became known as no boys. And that was how they showed their patriotism, by trying to believe in the Constitution, that they had rights, and they were not going to sign a loyalty oath. They found that offensive. These three guys were probably the most notable no boys. Gordon, Hirabayashi, Minoru Yasui. They both violated the curfew. Gordon was in Auburn, the White River area here in the Puget Sound area, and Yasumi was in Hood River. They violated the curfew. They were arrested. They took their cases all the way to the United States Supreme Court, but their convictions were upheld unanimously. Fred Korematsu from Oakland, California, he defied the forced removal. He stayed behind with his Italian-American girlfriend and changed his name and had his minor plastic surgery to his eyes. He was arrested. His case also went to the United States Supreme Court, but his conviction was upheld, not unanimous, but 6-3. All of these three men said, I am an American citizen. You're violating my rights. Now, we were also at war with these two countries, the Axis powers of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. But again, there was no exclusion orders for any of those folks. There would have been 14 million people, as I mentioned. We don't even have a city that can hold 10 million people in our nation right now. About 10,000 Germans and about 4,000 Italians were arrested. But all of them were arrested, and they had a suspicion of, charged with, or convicted of some sort of crime. Not one crime was ever charged with a Japanese American, let alone convicted. This would have changed history for this Italian American, Joe DiMaggio, or this German American, Dwight Eisenhower, who later became the five-star general who led the Allies to victory, and then a US president. They're making the case that this was unconstitutional, and these are the amendments. The Fourth Amendment is the one that he says, so you're right in your possessions, you must have a search warrant. All of those homes were searched and people were seized and taken away without any search warrant ever administered. The Fifth Amendment is very powerful. This is, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This is the amendment that sets America aside. Of any other country that has constitutional documents or public documents, we're the only one that gives persons rights. No matter how you get to this country, you cross the border at Mexico or Canada, you get off a cruise ship, you get off an airplane, a ship at a port. The minute you set foot on American soil, you are protected by the Constitution. You have due rights. And the 14th Amendment is the equal protection under the law. This is where not only have equal protection, but if you're born in America, that you are a US citizen. 2/3 of these Japanese Americans out of the 120,000 were US citizens. Now, J. Edgar Hoover, who had been surveilling everybody of Japanese ancestry since the mid-1930s, he had been surveilling everybody of 1/16th ancestry, and he created a database, and every time there was a new baby born, he had a new file made on them. And he told the president, I've got nothing. That's how he knew to go after those 14,000 Germans and Italians. He had those folks on the sites, but he told the president, I have no evidence of disloyalty of any Japanese. And the Attorney General, General Biddle, said, Mr. President, this is unconstitutional. What about the Fifth Amendment? All of these people, even though they're denied citizenship, they're still persons. And then he said, we have 75,000 potential lawsuits. These are all US citizens. And yet the Supreme Court, as I mentioned, held up convictions unanimously and or a 6-3 decision. So how are they able to do this if you are a person and a US citizen, as the Attorney General had argued? Well, the United States government came up with a new subclass. You're no longer a person, but you're now an alien. And the US citizens, the Japanese American children, are not citizens, but they're non-aliens. Because of those two lines written in these administrative documents, the exclusion order and the notices, the Supreme Court used that as one of the rationales that during a time of war, we can't have new classifications of your rights. Everybody knows this phrase. And here at the Manzanar National Historic Site, this beautiful graphic is up. You see the picture of the USS Arizona superimposed over the Twin Towers after they had fallen on Manhattan on September 11, 2001. And this is how a lot of people reacted after Pearl Harbor. And this is how a lot of people reacted in our nation after September 11, 2001. Now, urging people to do things, to fight and go kill on demand, is a very difficult thing unless you're a psychopath or sociopath. That's not hardwired. You have to do something to incite that kind of ability in a soldier, to create that kind of hate and that kind of ability to do that kind of violent act. And so the Germans in World War I elevated that to a new art form in their propaganda. You can see here's a Bolshevik, very dark-skinned and a big bloody knife, menacing the German woman there with her babies. Or you make your enemy not just looking evil, or make your enemy not even human. Here it is, Great Britain coming across the English Channel to attack the Germans. And they had other images that were very racist, very prejudicial, and in some cases almost pornographic. And so we've seen these. The United States said this was not in our standards, that the United States had a higher standard. We would never stoop to that kind of level because it was so ugly to see. But after Pearl Harbor, and after September 11th. This next image I'm going to share with you is something that was very popular. It might be akin to wearing a flag lapel pin or a yellow ribbon. It was something that was given out by businesses, community groups, churches, schools, to show your patriotism. This next one was given out by the United States Marines here, and this is actually in Hawaii. And they gave these out to these soldiers, and on it, it says, "You are hereby authorized to observe open season on all Japanese wherever contacted. The license carries no bag limit and may be used to good advantage during blackout hours. Hot lead leaves them dead." Blackout hours refers to the curfew of the Japanese Americans, not on the battlefield. This is a fundraising effort by a candidate in Missouri. He did win. He made thousands of dollars at $10 a pop. He won his election, but was moved out of office after about a year. And this is a poster put up a month after September 11th in October for a rally at a very progressive university. So all these years after the war, the first generation was pretty quiet. It was a moment of silence, of trying to hold all this stuff that was ugly and held within. In the final year of his office, Republican President Gerald Ford from Michigan, on our anniversary, July 4th, 1776, he removed Executive Order 9066, which started the opening of that's when I first learned about it, was what is this all about? Later that year, Mr. Ford was defeated by a Democratic governor from Georgia, Jimmy Carter. And because of that first removal by Gerald Ford, a lot of people, especially Japanese American third generation Sansei, started learning about the story and wanted to address it more. So in 1980, in Mr. Carter's term, he created a bipartisan committee to look into this record and figure out what happened truly to Japanese Americans in World War II. It was called the Commission on the Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. But later that year, in 1980, he was defeated by Republican Governor Ronald Reagan, and he became president. But Reagan, he had every right to not continue the commission by his predecessor, but he did continue it. And they completed their study. In December of 1982, they published a report called Personal Justice Denied. And that's after 2 years of hearings in 10 cities and more than 750 witnesses. This 467-page report found that there was no documented evidence of espionage or sabotage, nor was there any military necessity for the mass exclusion and incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans. But they unanimously found that it was found on this. It found that the exclusion, removal, and detention that's systematically conducted by the US government showed no documented evidence of espionage or sabotage, and there was no direct military necessity for detention. So in the late 1970s, people started to redress, and the redress movement started to address this. There was a writ of error of Norma Corpus to remove the charges that were placed against Kuramatsu, Minoru Yasui, and Gordon Hayabayashi in 1986. Those three men, standing in front of them, were their team of their Core Norbis legal team, Dale Minami, Tom Takami, and Peter Irons. All of their cases went to court. All of their cases were upheld. They were unanimously removed, that they found that the government hid evidence and that their charges were not warranted. The legislative memories also started. Here's a picture of the Japanese American Citizens League National Committee on Redress in the back. Karo Nobuyuki, Ron Mamiya, Clifford Ueda, Ron Idri, Tan Tashiya. And they're in the back with the four Japanese American members of Congress in the front. Senator Spark Matsunaga, Senator Daniel Inoue, Representative Robert Matsui, and Representative Norm Mineta. On August 10th, 1988, the Civil Liberties Act was passed. Ronald Reagan's in the front. Flanking him in the back is Hawaii Senator Spark Matsunaga, California Representative Norm Mineta, Hawaii Representative Pat Seki, California Senator Pete Wilson, Alaska Representative Don Young, California Representative Bob Matsui, California Representative Bill Lowry, and JACL President Harry Kajihara. So how to honor this? Here on Bainbridge Island, we start with these folks. They're the publishers and editors of the Bainbridge Island Review. They had bought the newspaper in 1941. He was a Seattle Times reporter. She was a writer. And about 5-6 months later, Pearl Harbor happened. They stayed up all night, like a lot of papers, and put out an editorial saying, these are our friends and neighbors. Let's not rush to a mob rule. Let's believe in the Constitution. When Roosevelt signed his executive order, he wrote a blistering editorial challenging the president, saying, have you not read the Bill of Rights, Mr. President? These are US citizens. He did something else. He had people write back from the camps every week. So there was a record of what was happening behind barbed wire to their Japanese American friends and neighbors. He's the only newspaper to do that and to have a constant editorial stance against the unconstitutionality of the Japanese Americans. It's one of the reasons why it made it a welcoming place to come back. Out of the 276 Japanese Americans on Bainbridge, 150 came back, and had more of them been able to own property, it could have been up to 200 and 230 perhaps. No other community, Seattle, San Francisco, anywhere, had anything close to that, maybe 15%, maybe 20% tops. Many places, zero came back because they had laws saying you could not return to your community. So Bainbridge Island is unique that way, but it wasn't all Pollyanna. This fellow, Lambert Schuyler, wrote this book, The Japs Must Not Come Back, A Practical Approach to the Racial Problem, a very white supremacist racial screed that was seen up and down the West Coast. I saw this in a museum in San Diego. So it was widespread on the West Coast, this fellow. Their story is well told by their daughter, Mary Woodward. Hope you can see it. And go to a library or go to a place and you can order it from us. It tells their story. And here's a picture of Fumiko Hayashida, and a picture on the right is in front of their house. And on the left there, she is about 98, her daughter is 70, and she's coming to the memorial. She was our star witness. She was 95 years old, testifying for our bill to become a National Historic Site. She said, I'm an old lady, I'm 95 years old, I hope to live long enough to see this memorial. And our vote, by the way, was always unanimous. It was bipartisan support, unanimous support up and down the entire country, red, blue, urban, rural, conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican. We passed it in 1988 and became a National Historic Site, Bainbridge Island Japanese American Exclusion Memorial, part of the Minidoka National Historic Site. So we hope our site will be a place of healing. Here's that picture of those 227 marching down on March 30th, and we built it at the very site of where their path was. So on the opposite side of Eagle Harbor, where you come in the ferry from Seattle, you enter it here. You come to the pavilion. You can see there behind it are these interpretive panels covering of which I've just discussed. You walk down to the memorial. You come through an entry gate. You see these panels here. You see the wall and cherry blossoms. All of these pictures, by the way, were taken by scores of Seattle Post-Intelligencer newspaper reporters and photographers. That's why we have such a documented record of what happened and the stories of all these people that took place there. Go across an entry gate, you come to our entry. This is made out of granite and old growth red cedar. Our motto, Nito to Nayoni, or let it not happen again. The wall is exactly 276 feet long. That's 1 foot for every Japanese American who lived on our island at the time. And at the end of this is where the ferry dock existed. This is our first introductory panel. Everybody's group, family by name and their age at that time during the war. And this first image is, I came to Bainbridge Island in 1908. It was a good place to raise a family. Pardon me. And that was by see this image? This is an image of the Bainbridge Island High School. Above the high school, the inscription reads, "I was born and raised on Bainbridge Island, and I'm a 100% American citizen. We will protect our flag, the United States flag." And on the wall of the high school, just a week before we were to leave, Coach Pop Miller put in all of the Japanese Americans. Despite errors and not hitting, he let us play the whole game. We lost 15-2, Paulo Taki. Above the crane, the inscription reads, "I felt like a second-class citizen to be herded onto the boat by soldiers with bayonets. It was the most humiliating experience of my life. Isami Nakao." Underneath the troop carrier tire, we were really careful. We were prisoners, and they had guns with spears. Fumiko Nishinaka Hayashida. This is our only three-dimensional image. It has barbed wire in the front. On the left, it reads, "The searchlights played on our windows back and forth all night. I couldn't sleep." Isami Nakao. On the right, back home at graduation, they had 13 empty chairs on the stage. That day, I felt so empty and sad. I sat on my bunk and I cried. Nobuku Sakai Omoto. You come to this part of the wall and you see there's no wall. In its place is the monolith of basalt that represents Minidoka. We don't have any wall here because this is a story of Japanese Americans on Bainbridge Island, but for 3.5 years, there were 0. So that's why no wall exists. This is their time away from the island. The final return panel, you can see here it's a group of 3. This was a deliberate choice to show how welcoming this island is. It's our only 3 full color panels as well. The first panel reads, "I was kind of afraid, but the neighbor girl that I used to play with came up and welcomed me. Ikiosu Imatsu Shibiyama." We put the farm under Mr. Raber's name while we were gone. When we came back, he returned it to us, Nobura Kura. My father and his brother worked so hard to build up Bainbridge Gardens. When we returned, there was nothing left. It must have broken him, Junko Horui. So you leave the memorial wall, you return on this path, you come along these interpretive panels along the way. In this first panel, windows were broken, personal belongings were all ransacked. My father wanted us to come back. Bainbridge was our home, so we came and made up our minds that we had to start over. We were thankful that we had our land. Fujiko Kobo Sakuma. Exclusion, removal, and detention inflicted tremendous human cost. There was the obvious cost of homes and businesses sold, as well as injury to careers and professional advancement. But most important, there was a loss of liberty and personal stigma of suspected loyalty. Personal justice denied report on the Commission on the Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, 1982. For these fundamental violations of the basic civil liberties and constitutional rights of these individuals of Japanese ancestry, the Congress apologizes on behalf of the nation, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. For here we admit a wrong, here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law. Ronald Reagan signing that Civil Liberties Act in 1988. I offer sincere apology to you for the actions that unfairly denied Japanese Americans and their families fundamental liberties during World War II. Bill Clinton Presidential Letter of Apology, 1993. You return to the site. You come across footbridge. There's our pavilion. Here are future plans to have an outdoor pavilion and a wood frame visitor center. Hopefully we'll be able to soon, and hope. This is the Pledge of Allegiance as it existed in 1942 under God was not added until 1954. And this is a quote from my predecessor, Dr. Frank Kitamoto, who was 2.5 years old when he was taken away, the president of the Japanese American community for over a quarter century. The last closing of one of his last speeches before he passed away. And what we like to leave with people is, it is not hate, it is fear. Fear drove what happened in World War II. The irony is that was something that the president of the United States said was the only thing we had to fear. Artificial or otherwise, it is what drives policies and actions that normally nobody would ever do in normal times. We're living in heightened fear now. We're living in a moment where we're all in a pandemic, and people who look like me are being attacked because some people have called it a Chinese virus or the Kung flu, the coronavirus 19. This is what people do. This is what people do when they're fearful. People want, when they're fearful, to have someone to blame. That's what happened in 1942. Unfortunately, history repeats itself too often. It is happening again, but what we hope people will be aspire to do is to stand up, speak out to your friends and neighbors, and try not to let it happen again to anyone else. Thank you very much.